Either you hand over your credit card to Evan or get out of my house, Karen said, her voice flat and rehearsed. She had practiced those words probably for days, waiting for the right moment to say them, to hit me where it hurt. It happened in the silence of a Sunday morning. I hadn't been ready for it. Nobody ever is. You don't expect your daughter to throw scalding coffee at you. You don't expect her to stand there, arms crossed, eyes cold, while you're left wondering if the very air between you is turning to ice. It started with an argument, well, a demand, really. The kind of demand that cuts through the fog of your daily life like a knife, and it wasn't the kind of thing you can just dismiss. No, this one had teeth. Either you hand over your credit card to Evan or get out of my house, Karen said, her voice flat and rehearsed. She had practiced those words probably for days, waiting for the right moment to say them, to hit me where it hurt. I froze, the sharpness of her words sinking into my chest like a slow poison. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. I had always prided myself on being there for my children. I sacrificed everything for them, late nights, early mornings, the sweat and blood of a firefighter. When their mother passed away, it was my job to hold the family together, to make sure Karen didn't fall apart. I thought that meant something. I thought it meant we were solid, but now I was a stranger in my own home. The mug tipped. The coffee hit me like a freight train, hot, searing, and unexpected. My skin burned immediately, but it was the insult that cut deeper. She watched me, a smirk creeping onto her face as if she had just dealt with an inconvenience. I couldn't even speak. I looked down at the dark stain spreading across my trousers. The pain a distant second to the betrayal that clawed at me from within. Karen, why? I finally managed to croak, my voice raspy from the hurt. She didn't answer. The silence between us stretched like a tightrope, unbearable and heavy. She just stood there, arms folded, waiting for my response, as if the life we shared meant nothing. She wasn't even upset, no anger, no regret, just indifference. And that was when I realized I had been erased. In that instant, I stopped being her father. In her eyes, I was no longer the man who had raised her, the man who had worked himself to the bone, the man who had loved her more than anything in this world. No, now I was a burden, a nuisance, a wallet she couldn't tap into enough. Get out, she said, turning her back to me and walking to the sink. If you won't help us, you're out. The words were cold, mechanical, and final. I wanted to scream. I wanted to fight back, but something inside me held me back. The burn on my skin throbbed, a constant reminder of the emotional and physical pain she had caused me, but I didn't move, not right away. I sat there. In that moment of shock, unable to comprehend the depth of what she had done. I didn't understand how we had come to this, how she had become this. I had given everything to her. I had sacrificed my life for her, and this was how she repaid me, with disdain, with bitterness, with cruelty. But I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to plead. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of my decision pressing on my chest. I looked at the door to the guest room, my room now. And I realized something. She thought I was weak. She thought I would cave. She thought I would beg her for forgiveness, that I would apologize for not helping her, for not giving her what she wanted. But I wasn't going to do that, not anymore. I straightened my back, wiped the coffee from my lap with a napkin, and calmly, deliberately walked past her without a word. I didn't turn back. I had to leave, but not in the way she thought, not in defeat. I grabbed my suitcase from the closet. It was dusty, but it was ready. I had known for months that this day might come. I had been waiting for it, though I hadn't known how it would play out. But now I understood. This wasn't just about a credit card. It wasn't about money. It was about control, and I had lost control, but not of my own will. She had taken it from me. As I packed, I noticed the photographs on the wall, family photos from years past. There was Karen. Just a child, her face lit up with innocence and love. There was her mother, smiling beside me, her eyes full of hope for the future. I thought I had done right by her. I thought I had given her everything, and now I was nothing more than a burden to her. I pulled out the envelope from the nightstand drawer. It contained important documents I had hidden away long ago, my birth certificate, my bank routing number, and a few insurance cards. I had never been sure why I had kept them there, but as I looked at them, it all became clear. I had known. I had known this day would come, when I would need something to remind me who I was, something to prove that I wasn't just her ATM, that I wasn't just a tool to be discarded when no longer useful. I stuffed them into my jacket pocket, and with one last look at the house I had once thought was my home, I left. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay here. I couldn't stay in a place where my own daughter had spat in my face, figuratively and literally. And as I walked away, a promise formed in my chest, one I hadn't made to her. No, this promise was to myself. She would learn that contempt always comes at a cost. Richard Hale sat at his worn kitchen table, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. At 68 years old, he was no stranger to struggle. He had spent over 2 decades as a firefighter, running into burning buildings, saving lives, and battling blazes that could consume entire neighborhoods. The work had been hard, dangerous, and at times terrifying, but it had also been straightforward. Fires had clear beginnings and endings. And as long as you did your job right, you knew the outcome. But this was different. This wasn't a fire that could be put out with a hose and a team of brave souls. This was a slow burn, a simmering discontent that had been building for years in his own home. He had always been proud of his family, especially of Karen, his only daughter. For years, he had worked tirelessly to provide for her, to raise her after her mother, Mary, passed away. He had poured everything he had into her upbringing, sacrificing his health, his time, and his energy to ensure she would have the best opportunities in life. But now, as he sat at the kitchen table, the empty mug of coffee beside him and the silence stretching between them, Richard realized something profound. He didn't recognize her anymore. The young woman who had poured coffee on him with that cold, indifferent look on her face wasn't the same little girl he had raised. Karen had changed, or perhaps, Richard wondered, he had been too blind to see the cracks forming in their relationship over the years. He stared at the photograph on the wall, a picture of Karen, just a little girl, standing beside him, her face filled with innocent joy. She had once looked at him with such admiration, trusting him with everything she was. The memory was still fresh, and it pained him to think of how things had deteriorated. He could remember the late nights spent helping her with homework, the school plays he had never missed, and the countless moments when she needed him and he had always been there. But now he had become a burden to her. The relationship between Richard and Karen had always been close, at least that's what he believed. After his wife, Mary, passed away, he threw himself into being the best father he could be. He worked 2 jobs to ensure they could live comfortably, always making sure Karen had everything she needed, even if it meant sacrificing his own needs. And when Karen had gotten older, he had continued to support her, guiding her through high school and college, always encouraging her to chase her dreams. Richard had been proud when Karen graduated from college. He had been there front and center, supporting her through every milestone. He had thought their bond was unbreakable, but then came the distance. At first, he chalked it up to her becoming independent, after all. Wasn't that the goal of every parent, to raise children who could stand on their own? But independence had morphed into something else. Karen had begun to drift away emotionally. It started with fewer phone calls, then less time spent together. Holidays became nothing more than a formality. She didn't call on his birthday, and one Thanksgiving, she missed dinner because of work. Richard had convinced himself it was just part of her growing up, that it was nothing personal. But as the years went on, he started to see the cracks in the facade, the subtle signs of control masked as care. Karen began to manage everything for him. She handled his bills, took care of his grocery shopping, and even made sure he didn't overexert himself after his hip surgery. It felt like help at first, but slowly it became apparent that she wasn't helping, she was taking control of his life. Karen had become the one who dictated his routine, his choices, and his decisions. At first, Richard resisted. He had always been independent, but slowly, little by little, he allowed her to take charge. He was tired, after all. The surgeries had left him worn out, and the idea of being taken care of seemed appealing. But now, as Richard sat in his kitchen, he realized the toll that had taken. Karen had worn him down. He had allowed himself to become dependent on her in ways he hadn't even noticed. He had let her control not just his finances, but his entire life. And now that control was slipping away, replaced by something far more sinister: entitlement. The day Karen demanded Richard's credit card had been the breaking point. It wasn't just the demand itself, it was the way she said it, the coldness in her voice, the way she treated him like nothing more than an object to be used when necessary. Richard had never expected this from her. It wasn't just about the money, it was about her treating him like he didn't matter, like he was no longer her father, but a resource to be exploited. "You either give Evan your credit card or get out of my house," Karen had said. The words hit Richard harder than any physical blow. He didn't know how to respond at first. His throat tightened and his heart began to race. How had it come to this? How had the daughter he raised, the daughter who once trusted him with everything, turned into someone who would treat him like this? Evan, her 16-year-old son, was sitting across the table, completely disengaged. He barely even looked at Richard. He was a kid who expected everything to be handed to him, and his mother was only too happy to oblige. $6,000 for gaming setup. It wasn't a request, it was a demand, and Karen, as always, was backing him up, treating Richard's refusal as a personal offense. As the coffee spilled on his lap, burning him, Richard finally found his voice. "I'm not giving him my card, Karen," he said quietly. Her response was swift and final. She turned her back on him, walked to the sink, and rinsed her hands as if the whole thing was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. It wasn't the coffee. It wasn't even the words she had said. It was the fact that she had erased him from her life. She had turned her back on him, and in that moment, Richard knew that he was no longer her father. He was just a pawn in her game. Richard didn't argue. He didn't beg. Instead, he sat in silence, absorbing the weight of the moment. He felt the heat of the coffee on his skin, but it was nothing compared to the coldness in his heart. His daughter had just told him in no uncertain terms that he wasn't wanted, and yet he didn't feel defeated. For the first time in years, he felt alive. Richard's decision was simple. He would leave, but not in the way Karen expected, not in the way anyone expected. He wouldn't beg, he wouldn't grovel. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him crumble under the weight of her cruelty. He would leave, and he would never return the way she thought. Richard walked to his guest room, the space that had become his own sanctuary in the last few months. The room was small, and it smelled faintly of antiseptic and laundry detergent, but it was his. It was his space to think, to reflect, to try and figure out where things had gone wrong. As he opened the closet and pulled out his suitcase, the memories hit him like a flood. He opened the drawer and found the envelope containing the documents he had tucked away months ago. His birth certificate, his bank routing number, and a slip of paper with the bank's details written in his shaky hand. Why had he kept these? And then it hit him. He had known. Some part of him had known that this day would come, that the woman he had once loved and raised would eventually treat him like this. He had kept these documents as a precaution, a lifeline for the day when he would need to reclaim his independence. Richard packed his bags slowly, methodically, as if each item he put into the suitcase was a small step toward reclaiming his life. The burn on his leg still throbbed, but it wasn't the pain that mattered. It was the realization that he had been wronged and that he was done being a doormat. Richard paused for a moment and looked around the room, the photos on the wall, the years spent building this life. It was all falling apart, but one thing he was certain of: he would not go down without a fight. His silence was not surrender. His silence was a promise that he would rise from this. He would not let his daughter and her husband erase him from existence. He would stand tall and claim his life back. The evening was quiet, an eerie stillness hanging in the air. Richard sat in his small apartment, the only light coming from a single lamp in the corner. The silence was overwhelming, but it was also comforting. After the chaos of the past few days, he found peace in the quiet. His mind was clear, his thoughts focused. He had made the decision to leave his daughter's house to reclaim his life. But there was one thing he had yet to do: let go of the past. As he sat in his chair, sipping his coffee, he allowed himself to reflect. The burnt coffee stains on his trousers were a symbol, one that would stay with him as a reminder of how far he had fallen. Yet in the pain there was clarity. He had finally come to understand that his daughter was no longer the person he had raised. She had changed, and so had he. The question was no longer about why this had happened, but how he would move forward. Just as he began to let his thoughts drift, the phone rang. Richard's heart skipped a beat. He had been expecting this, but he hadn't thought it would come so soon. It was Karen. His stomach tightened as he picked up the phone. "Hello," Richard's voice was steady, but his heart was racing. "Hi, Dad." Karen's voice was soft, tentative, as though she was testing the waters. I wanted to check on you, see how you're doing." Richard's jaw tightened. He could hear the effort in her voice, the rehearsed sweetness that didn't quite mask the underlying tension. She hadn't called him in weeks, and now, after everything, she was suddenly concerned. The words "we need to talk" were hanging in the air between them, unsaid but heavy with expectation. "I'm fine, Karen," he replied, his voice colder than he had intended. "I'm doing well, considering everything." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by a sigh. Karen was trying to find the right words. I'm sorry about everything. I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. The apology, though expected, felt hollow. You've said that before, he said quietly, his tone flat, and every time things only get worse. The silence grew thick again, and for a moment Richard wondered if Karen would hang up. But then she spoke again, this time with more urgency in her voice. Dad, listen, there's something I need to tell you. It's about Evan. He's in trouble, and it's my fault. Her words rushed out in a jumble. He's been asking for money for a gaming setup, and I told him you could help, but I didn't expect it to turn into this. He's angry, Dad. He thinks you're holding out on him. He's blaming you for everything, and I don't know what to do anymore. Richard's mind raced. Evan, his grandson, a boy who just a few short years ago had been full of life, energy, and innocence. And now he was part of this twisted web of entitlement and manipulation. Richard had always been there for his family, even when it was difficult. But this was a betrayal of everything he had worked for. So you're calling me for money? Richard's voice was a low growl, the frustration bubbling to the surface. You're calling me after everything, asking for a favor. Karen's voice faltered. No, Dad, that's not it. But Richard wasn't done. He stood up, his legs stiff from the long hours of sitting, but the anger inside him made him move. He paced the room, clutching the phone tightly in his hand. You don't get to do this. You don't get to call me when it's convenient for you. After everything you've done, everything I've been through, you think I'm just going to give in and help you. I've had enough. Karen's voice broke, almost desperate. I didn't mean to hurt you, Dad, but Evan needs this, and we're so far behind on everything. The bills, the mortgage, I don't know where else to turn. Richard's chest tightened. But this time he didn't give in to the guilt. You want to talk about needs, Karen? What about my needs? Where were you when I was recovering from my surgery? Where were you when I needed help, when I couldn't even walk without assistance? You were too busy, too focused on your own life to care, and now you want me to fix everything. Karen fell silent on the other end of the line, the weight of his words settling in. Richard could feel her guilt through the phone. But he couldn't bring himself to soften, not now. Listen, Karen finally said, her voice shaky. I don't want this to be the end. I don't want us to be like this. I want to fix things, Dad. I don't know how. Richard paused, the anger slowly ebbing away, replaced by a hollow emptiness. You want to fix things? You've been breaking everything for years, Karen, and you think one apology will make it better, one phone call. The truth was, he didn't believe she could fix it anymore. He had believed in her once, but that belief had been shattered piece by piece. And now all that was left was the cold, hard truth. Karen wasn't the person he thought she was. Goodbye, Karen, Richard said quietly. I hope you figure it out, but I'm done. Without waiting for a response, Richard ended the call. As Richard set the phone down, the weight of the conversation hit him like a ton of bricks. He felt empty. He felt betrayed. This wasn't just about the money, about the card or the gaming setup. This was about everything. The years of sacrifice. The missed opportunities, the love he had poured into his daughter, and the way she had repaid him. Contempt, that was the word that came to mind, the way she had dismissed him, the way she had erased him from her life. His silence, once a form of strength, now felt like the only weapon he had left. But what good was silence when the enemy didn't even care? He moved over to the window, staring out at the street below. The world moved on, indifferent to his pain. Indifferent to the mess his family had become, and yet within him something shifted. He had promised himself that this debt of contempt would be paid, not with money, but with something deeper, with the truth. Richard knew in that moment that he would not be erased, not anymore. The phone call had triggered something inside him. He realized that everything he had done, every decision he had made, had led him to this point, the time for appeasing Karen. For letting her dictate the terms of their relationship was over. He had been the one to give in, to compromise for far too long, but not anymore. The next few days passed in a blur. Richard took no calls, answered no messages. He had made his decision. He would fight, not just for his money, but for his dignity, for his place in the world, and for his sense of self-worth. The idea of being manipulated, of being used by his own daughter, had finally broken something inside him. This was no longer about her needs, it was about his survival. As he sat at his kitchen table, his hands shaking slightly, he wrote down the next steps. He couldn't go back to Karen's house. He wouldn't. He had to act fast. The first thing he needed was legal advice. He would find someone who could help him protect his assets, someone who could expose the lies and deceit that had taken root in his life. But most importantly, he needed to take back control. He wasn't just fighting for money anymore. He was fighting for his dignity, his independence, and his future. and he would never let Karen or Mark take that from him again. The days stretched on, each one blending seamlessly into the next as Richard moved through them like a ghost. His apartment, once a place of solitude that had offered a quiet refuge, now felt suffocating, like a cell he had built for himself. The familiar walls, the muted furniture, the constant hum of the refrigerator, it all seemed to mock him now. Where once there had been a sense of peace, there was now only the echo of emptiness. Every morning, Richard woke to the same silence. No more laughter, no more footsteps of a daughter growing older in front of him. Every phone call he ignored, every message he deleted, felt like a choice to sever the last remnants of connection. It was as if his entire life had been a lie, built on the misguided assumption that his sacrifices meant something, that his love and devotion would yield respect, or at the very least, appreciation. But now, all he had were the shards of his shattered heart. It was late afternoon when the knock on the door came. Richard had been sitting at the table, staring at the remnants of a half-finished meal. His mind wandered in a haze, reflecting on the past, searching for answers, trying to piece together the timeline of his life before everything had fallen apart. The silence in the room was oppressive, but Richard no longer sought the comfort of noise. He had become accustomed to it. When the knock came again, louder this time, his heart skipped a beat. He wasn't expecting anyone, he had no reason to entertain anyone. But as he stood up slowly with a heaviness in his legs, he knew it would be Karen. Opening the door, he was met by her, still the same woman, the same face, but so different now. There were no more hugs, no more smiles, only a distant, cold expression. Her eyes, once filled with innocence and trust, were now clouded by something far darker. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice flat as if rehearsed. There was no warmth, no apology in the tone, only the cold realization that this was a confrontation, not a conversation. Richard didn't say anything at first. He simply stared at her, taking in the subtle changes in her appearance. Her posture was stiffer now, the confidence of a woman who had learned to play the game of manipulation all too well. She wasn't the little girl who had once run to him for comfort, the child who had clung to him in fear and need. She was now an adult, someone who had discarded the love and respect that once existed between them. "I need to talk to you," she began again, this time her voice trembling slightly, but Richard didn't wait for her to finish. "Not now, Karen," he muttered, trying to shut the door, but Karen quickly placed her hand on it, preventing him from closing it completely. She wasn't going to let him shut her out, not now. She hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I can't go on like this, Dad. I know I messed up, but Evan, he's so angry. He thinks I'm failing him. You're the only one who can fix this." Richard felt a twist of something sharp in his chest. Fix this? How could she expect him to fix anything when she had broken it all? "You can't expect me to do this for you," he replied harshly, his voice cracking, though he tried to keep it steady. "You've turned everything upside down, Karen. You think I'm just supposed to jump in and fix it. You don't even see what you've done. You've lost my trust. You've lost my respect." Her face flushed. For a moment he could see the flicker of guilt in her eyes, but it was fleeting. She quickly replaced it with something else, something cold, almost calculating. "I know I've made mistakes, but Evan doesn't deserve to suffer for them. I've been trying, Dad. You don't know how hard it is. Dealing with him, managing everything, the bills, the house." Her words were a mix of excuses and manipulation, as if she believed that he owed her for the burden she had placed on herself. But Richard couldn't help but feel a deeper rage building inside him. "No, stop, this is your doing," he shot back, his voice louder this time, the anger building. "You think that because you've done everything for me, I'm supposed to just forgive it all? Forgive the way you pushed me out, the way you manipulated everything. You made your choices, Karen, and they hurt me. They hurt this family." There was a silence between them, a moment where the weight of his words hit both of them. But instead of backing down, Karen stepped forward, her face tightening. "I don't have time for this, Dad," she snapped, her voice rising. "Evan needs me and you're in the way. I can't keep doing this with you. I'm trying to keep everything together and you're making it worse. You're a burden." Richard felt his heart pound, but he didn't flinch. His voice was cold but steady. "If I'm a burden, then go. I'm done, Karen. I'm done. I've given everything I had to you, to this family. And what do I get in return? This betrayal." Her face turned red with frustration, her hands shaking. "I never wanted this to happen, Dad, but you don't get it. You think I'm evil, but I'm just trying to survive. You've always been the one who kept things together, but now I'm the one who has to do it. I need you. I need your help, please." The desperation in her voice broke Richard's resolve for a split second. For a moment, he wanted to reach out. He wanted to take her in his arms and tell her that everything would be all right, that he forgave her, that they could somehow mend this brokenness, but he didn't. Instead, Richard stepped back, closed the door gently but firmly. His heart felt as though it were being crushed, but he didn't let her see. He couldn't let her see. The days that followed the visit were filled with a quiet anguish. Richard didn't go out much. He stayed inside, not because he didn't want to face the world, but because the world was too painful to confront. The faces of his daughter, of his son-in-law, lingered in his mind like specters. The truth, his truth, had been ignored, trampled on, and twisted by the very people who were supposed to love him. What hurt the most was not the betrayal itself, but the realization that Karen had never truly seen him. She had always seen him as a provider, as someone who could be relied on, someone who existed only for their convenience. He had been the stable rock in her life, and once she had climbed to her perch, she had discarded him. Richard's mind wandered back to the old days, to the moments when Karen was a child, a girl who had looked up to him, a girl who had trusted him implicitly. But that girl was gone now, and in her place stood a woman who had chosen greed, entitlement, and manipulation. It was not just the financial betrayal that tore him apart, but the emotional void that had opened between them, like a canyon that no longer could be crossed. His silence, his refusal to give in, had turned into a declaration of war. The love he had once given so freely had turned to dust, leaving behind a bitter residue. That night Richard lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the dark shadows moving with the rhythm of his breathing. His mind was numb. He had become a stranger in his own life, an observer of his own suffering. His daughter was gone, the family he had worked so hard to build was gone, and all that remained was the quiet emptiness of his thoughts. But in that silence, something began to stir within him. The anger, the bitterness, the grief, they had all settled into his bones. But now there was something else, something deeper. It wasn't just about fighting back. It wasn't about money or revenge. It was about dignity. It was about reclaiming the man he had once been. The man who had worked tirelessly to support his family, the man who had never backed down from a challenge, the man who had once been full of love and strength. And now, for the first time, Richard was ready to fight, not for his daughter, not for his son-in-law, but for himself. The morning after the breakdown, Richard made a decision. It was time to step away from the remnants of his old life and embrace the pain of the moment. He would no longer be the victim of his own narrative. He would be the hero of his own story. The silence of the night had turned into something powerful. Richard knew he had lost everything: his family, his trust, his sense of belonging. But what he had gained in the process was far more valuable: his freedom. Richard's life, as he knew it, was unraveling. The bitter sting of Karen's words, "You're a burden," echoed in his mind like a cruel mantra. They replayed constantly, over and over again, as if mocking him. The day she spilled coffee on him, the physical burn was nothing compared to the emotional scars that followed. That scalding coffee wasn't just a fiery substance that had burned through his skin. It was the symbolic moment where everything he believed in about love and family had shattered into irreparable pieces. As Richard sat in his dimly lit apartment, staring at the wall in front of him, he could feel the weight of abandonment pressing down on his chest. It wasn't just about Karen's refusal to help him or the cruel words she had said. It was the deeper realization that his daughter, the one he had spent decades raising, had completely erased him from her life. She no longer saw him as a father, but as an inconvenient relic, a person to be tolerated at best. The person who had once been his reason to keep going, his daughter, had turned into someone who disregarded everything he had ever done for her. Richard ran his hand through his graying hair, frustration and anger simmering beneath the surface. He had spent so many years giving, sacrificing, trying to provide everything Karen and Evan needed. Yet, in her eyes, it was all for nothing. There were no words left between them that weren't tainted by a sense of obligation and entitlement. The ache in his heart deepened with each passing minute. The same ache that had been growing for years now felt unbearable. There was no coming back from this. The family that he had fought so hard to protect had grown cold and indifferent, and the very essence of his relationship with Karen was being chipped away, piece by piece. The following days blurred into one another. Richard didn't leave his apartment much. He spent most of his time sitting in his favorite chair, staring at nothing in particular. His body ached, a constant reminder of his age, of his frailty, but his heart ached worse. The burn from the coffee, though healed, still felt fresh in his memory. But now it wasn't the burn on his skin that tormented him. It was the burn of rejection, the emotional scar that Karen had branded him with. Richard wasn't the kind of man to dwell on his feelings for too long. His years as a firefighter had taught him to push through pain, to suppress emotion and focus on survival. But this was different. This wasn't a physical injury. It was an emotional wound so deep that even he didn't know how to navigate it. And for the first time in his life, Richard didn't know what to do. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the image of Karen standing over him in the kitchen, her arms folded, her face devoid of remorse. Her eyes, once filled with warmth, now held only cold calculation. The lack of apology from her stung deeper than the coffee ever could. The silence that followed her departure from his life was deafening. It was a silence of betrayal, and it cut him to the core. There were moments when Richard considered calling her. He imagined his voice cracking as he begged her to see reason, to recognize all he had done for her. But then he remembered her smirk, her indifference, and he quickly dismissed the thought. He couldn't beg for the love and respect that she had so easily discarded. No matter how much it hurt, he had to stand firm. Richard had always believed that love, when given selflessly, would create a bond that could withstand anything. But now he felt as though all his efforts had been in vain. The relationship with his daughter, once his greatest source of pride, had been poisoned by resentment and entitlement. He could no longer recognize Karen in the woman who had dismissed him so easily. She had become someone else, someone who no longer valued the sacrifices he had made. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how alone he truly was. In the weeks that followed, Richard's life became a monotonous routine of survival. He woke up each morning not for any specific reason, but simply because he had no choice. His days were empty, and the loneliness hung over him like a heavy cloak. Every meal felt tasteless, every chore felt pointless. His thoughts constantly returned to Karen and Evan. What had gone wrong? What had he missed? He replayed their interactions, searching for the exact moment things had started to change. Had he been too lenient, too trusting, or had the damage already been done before he even realized it? Richard could no longer ignore the truth. The family he had once believed in had turned its back on him. His daughter had transformed into someone unrecognizable, a stranger who no longer saw him as her father, but as an obstacle to her own desires. His thoughts spiraled into a pit of grief, deeper than any sadness he had ever felt. One evening, as Richard sat at the kitchen table, a quiet thought crossed his mind. Maybe I wasn't enough for her. The question lingered in his thoughts, unanswered but haunting. He had given her everything: a stable home, a career that kept food on the table, the emotional support of a father who would always be there. Yet none of it seemed to matter anymore. What had it all been for if she could so easily discard him? Richard thought back to when Karen was a child. He remembered the joy of holding her in his arms, the trust in her eyes, the love she showed him without reservation. Back then he had believed that no matter what happened, they would always be a family. But now it seemed that the only thing left of their relationship was a hollow shell of what used to be. He couldn't help but wonder what went wrong. Was it the years of sacrifice, the long hours spent at the firehouse, never truly home? Had his absence made her resent him, or was it simply that the love he gave her had been replaced by something far more damaging: entitlement? The day that Mark showed up at Richard's apartment was the tipping point. Richard had been expecting it. He had known that it was only a matter of time before Mark would come looking for a confrontation. Mark had always been the manipulative type, calculating, smug, and quick to point fingers when things went wrong. But Richard had no intention of letting Mark walk all over him any longer. When Mark entered the apartment, Richard didn't move. He simply watched Mark pace around the room, his hands clenched in anger. Mark was visibly frustrated, his face red with rage. "You need to fix this," Mark snapped. "You're the one who's standing in the way. Karen's trying, but you just keep making everything worse." Richard's eyes narrowed. For a moment, the old Richard would have tried to calm the situation, tried to find common ground, but not anymore. This wasn't about trying to fix things, it was about standing up for himself. "Fix it," Richard repeated, his voice steady but firm. "You want me to fix your mess, Mark? You're the one who pushed me out, who erased me from my own daughter's life. You think I don't see what's going on here? You think I don't know what you've done?" Mark's jaw clenched, his expression hardening. "You don't understand. You're the one who refused to help. Karen's been trying to hold it all together, and you're making it impossible." Richard's heart tightened in anger, but he didn't let it show. Instead, he stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving Mark's. "I'm done," he said coldly. "I'm done helping, done sacrificing. You two made your bed, now you'll lie in it. If you think I'm going to bail you out, you've got another thing coming." Mark seemed to falter, his anger dissipating for just a moment. He hadn't expected this reaction. Richard didn't need to say anything else. His silence, his resolve, spoke volumes. It was in this moment, as Richard watched Mark walk out the door, that he realized something vital. He wasn't broken. He had been walking on the edge of despair for weeks, drowning in his grief and anger, but now he felt something shift. The tight knot in his chest began to loosen, not because his family had turned against him, but because he had finally taken control of his own fate. For so long, Richard had been the one who gave, who sacrificed, who hoped, but no more. The man who had raised a daughter with love and devotion was no longer going to be a victim of that love. The breakdown wasn't just a moment of despair, it was the beginning of Richard's reclamation of his own dignity. The pain, the grief, the sense of betrayal, they were still there, but they no longer had the power to define him. As the days passed, Richard began to recognize that this breakdown had led him to something he hadn't expected: freedom. He was no longer bound by the expectations of others, by the guilt of past decisions. The quiet that had once suffocated him now felt different. It was no longer the silence of erasure, but the silence of self-preservation. For the first time in weeks, Richard felt the stirrings of something new, a fire, a determination to reclaim his life. He wasn't just going to fade away. He wasn't going to let his daughter's betrayal be the final chapter of his story. The breakdown, as painful and overwhelming as it had been, was the catalyst for Richard's transformation. And as he sat alone in his apartment, looking out over the city skyline, he finally understood the depth of his loss and the strength he had gained in the process. After weeks of sinking into a pit of despair, Richard found himself at an unexpected crossroads. It wasn't a moment of dramatic revelation or divine intervention. No, this change was quiet, slow, almost imperceptible, like the first light of dawn creeping over the horizon. Sitting in his apartment, Richard felt something shift within him. It wasn't the rush of anger or revenge, nor the suffocating sadness that had become his constant companion. It was a calmness, a clarity that he hadn't known in years. It began with a thought that had been silently growing in his mind for some time: I don't have to live like this anymore. At first, the thought seemed almost absurd. How could he simply stop feeling the weight of betrayal? How could he stop feeling like a victim when so much had been taken from him? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that everything he had endured had been a result of him allowing himself to remain in a state of victimhood. He had spent too many years chasing after his daughter's approval, justifying every sacrifice he had made for her. He had allowed himself to be manipulated by the very people who were supposed to care for him the most, but no more. Richard's eyes scanned the room. The familiar walls and quiet spaces that had once felt like a prison now felt different. The stillness wasn't stifling anymore, it was breathing space. He didn't need Karen's validation anymore. He didn't need to be the man who endlessly gave and sacrificed for others in exchange for love that was never truly reciprocated. The love he had given wasn't the problem, it was his need for it that had made him weak. The shift had begun. The morning after this realization, Richard stood at his kitchen counter, preparing coffee. As he watched the dark liquid swirl into the cup, he felt a new sense of power flowing through him. It was subtle, but it was there. His thoughts turned to the months that had passed since Karen's coffee spill, the devastation it had caused, and how much it had hurt. Yet despite all that pain, Richard had never been defeated, not truly. No, what had happened was that he had simply forgotten who he was. He had been a father. A man who had fought fires, saved lives, and faced adversity time and time again. He had the strength to face anything, to rebuild, to rise from the ashes. This was the moment Richard decided to reclaim his life. He made the decision not out of vengeance, but out of necessity, for himself. The bitterness that had festered inside him for so long was starting to fade, replaced with a firm resolve. No longer was he going to cower in silence, waiting for the people who had wronged him to come around and apologize. He was done waiting. This time he would take charge of his own fate. Richard had never been one to indulge in regret. but in that moment he realized how many opportunities for growth and self-discovery he had missed in his attempts to placate others. His relationship with Karen, his daughter, was fractured beyond repair. That was the painful truth, but it was also the truth that set him free. He wasn't going to let her take him down with her. As the days passed, Richard began to reflect on the entirety of his relationship with Karen. They had been close once, but over the years their connection had eroded. It wasn't just the coffee spill that had been the breaking point, it was the culmination of years of resentment, unspoken frustrations, and misunderstandings. He remembered the years he had spent as a firefighter, the long hours, and the exhaustion that left him little time for family. He had sacrificed everything, believing that his work would ultimately give his family a better life. But now he saw how much of that sacrifice had been unnoticed, how much of his love had gone unappreciated. Richard had been too focused on being a provider, a protector. In doing so, he had neglected to protect himself from the emotional damage that had slowly crept in over the years. The truth was painful, but it was also liberating. He had loved Karen more than anything in this world, and that love had blinded him. He had always believed that if he loved her enough, she would eventually come around. But love without boundaries, love without self-respect, had only allowed Karen to manipulate him. Her sense of entitlement had become so ingrained that she couldn't even see the damage she had done. The betrayal had been her choice, and while it hurt him deeply, Richard understood now that the only person responsible for his suffering was himself. He had allowed it. Richard's thoughts turned to his next move. He knew he needed to act, to stop letting his silence be interpreted as submission. The more he thought about it, the more he realized he had been holding onto a version of his daughter that no longer existed. The Karen he had raised, the little girl who had looked to him for comfort, the young woman who had once trusted him with her dreams, was gone. In her place was someone who no longer saw him as a father, but as an inconvenience. But Richard wasn't going to fight for a relationship that had no foundation. Instead, he was going to fight for his own dignity, his own independence. He began to see how much power he had given away, how much of himself he had sacrificed in the name of family. The real battle wasn't against Karen, it was against the person he had become in order to appease her. Richard knew that there was no going back. His daughter had made her choice, and so had he. It was time to stop trying to fit into a family that didn't want him and instead create a future for himself. The sense of freedom he felt was palpable. For the first time in months, he felt as though he could breathe again. This was his life, his fight, and he would win it, not by force, but by regaining control over his choices. With every passing day, Richard grew more resolute in his decision. He didn't need Karen's approval. He didn't need to play the part of the victim anymore. His silence in the face of her betrayal had been misunderstood, and now it was time for the truth to emerge. The next time Karen called, Richard didn't hesitate. He didn't let the old feelings of guilt or obligation cloud his judgment. When the phone rang, he picked it up, his voice calm and steady. Karen's frantic tone did nothing to sway him. She needed money again. She needed his help with Evan, her bills, the house, but this time Richard wasn't going to be manipulated. "Karen," he said, his voice firm, "I'm not giving you anything. I'm not helping you anymore. You've crossed a line. And you need to deal with the consequences of your actions." There was silence on the other end of the line, followed by the unmistakable sound of Karen's broken sobs. But Richard didn't feel the familiar tug of guilt. He felt strength. For the first time, he felt like he was in control, that he wasn't a passive player in the drama of his own life. Richard didn't know exactly what the future held, but for the first time in months, he was ready to face it head-on. The past few weeks had been filled with emotional turmoil, but they had also led him to a place of clarity. He knew that his journey wasn't over. There would still be struggles, but he now had the emotional resilience to tackle them. With each decision he made, Richard grew stronger. His path forward was no longer defined by his need to please others, to seek validation from a family that had turned its back on him. The inner shift had been made, and with that shift, Richard knew that he had finally reclaimed his life. Slowly unraveled the layers of emotional baggage that had trapped him, and now, with steady hands and clear thoughts, he was prepared to make the people who betrayed him feel the weight of their own actions. Revenge in this case was not about violence or anger. It was about the law, the undeniable weight of truth, and the consequences of manipulation. Richard had already felt the power shift within him. His silence had been mistaken for weakness. But he was about to make it clear that he was not broken. Silence, he realized, didn't mean surrender. It meant control. He had learned the hard way that power wasn't something you demanded, it was something you reclaimed, quietly but firmly. He had already made one decision: he wasn't going to let the injustices slide. No longer would he be the passive player in a game that had always been rigged against him. The coffee incident had been the trigger. It had shown him how deeply the betrayal ran. But it wasn't until he held his bank statements in his hands and read the transactions that had drained his accounts without his consent that he knew he had to act. Richard had long since stopped pretending everything would simply go back to normal. The time for making amends or trying to restore what was lost had passed. The documents from the bank, the screenshots of unauthorized withdrawals, the forged signatures, it was all building up to something bigger. These weren't just mistakes or misunderstandings. These were deliberate acts of fraud, and they had to be held accountable. He had already collected the necessary evidence. The last thing Richard needed was to act impulsively. Instead, he took a calculated approach, leaning into the one thing Karen and Mark had underestimated: his patience. For the first time in a long while, Richard didn't feel the rush of anger. There was no immediate urge to strike out at the people who had wronged him. Instead, he took everything in, each document, each transaction, with careful precision. He had started this journey as a man unsure of his place, but now he stood on solid ground. The next step was clear. He was going to take them down, one methodical step at a time. Richard had already called in the people he needed to help him with the legal and financial aspects of his case. His lawyer, the same one who had guided him through the trust and the fraud report, was ready to proceed with filing the necessary paperwork. But Richard knew that there was a deeper, personal level of justice he needed to pursue. He was about to use the one thing that Karen and Mark never expected: evidence. Their arrogance had made them believe that they could get away with everything. They thought Richard was old, out of touch, and too vulnerable to fight back. What they didn't know was that Richard had been a firefighter for most of his life. He had faced danger, injury, and fear in countless ways, but through it all, he had learned one thing: never underestimate the power of someone who has nothing left to lose. This wasn't just a legal battle, it was about reclaiming his dignity, showing his daughter and her husband that they couldn't just erase him from their lives. They would face the consequences of their actions, and they would do so in the most public, irreversible way. Richard's lawyer, Denise, was a woman who got things done. She was efficient, no-nonsense, and sharp. They had already made substantial progress, filing a formal complaint with the bank about the unauthorized transactions and securing a hold on the fraudulent accounts. But Richard wanted more. He needed to make sure that this would have a lasting impact on Karen and Mark, and he knew exactly where to hit them. The strategy was simple: take everything from them legally and financially while making sure they knew who had caused it. Richard decided to move forward with a lawsuit for financial fraud and abuse. This would hit Mark and Karen where it hurt the most: their money, their reputations, and their sense of control. With Denise's expertise, they filed a lawsuit that would expose the financial manipulation they had orchestrated behind the scenes. It was a strategy that would leave them with no room to maneuver, no way out. Richard knew it wasn't just about winning the lawsuit. The power lay in the legal records, in the paper trail that would show just how far Karen and Mark had gone. When the court reviewed the forged signatures, the manipulated documents, and the trail of stolen funds, there would be nowhere for them to hide. The truth would be undeniable. As the lawsuit progressed, Richard began to take a more visible approach to his revenge. He knew that Karen and Mark had relied on the quiet, subdued way he had always dealt with conflict. But now it was time for them to face the consequences publicly. They thought they had gotten away with their manipulations. They thought the silence and the quiet suffering of their father had been a sign of weakness. But Richard was about to make sure they realized how wrong they were. He had the support of his lawyer and a clear legal path forward, but Richard also understood the power of public perception. It wasn't enough for Mark and Karen to lose in court. They needed to lose everything they had worked so hard to keep up: their reputation, their pride, their control. Richard began leaking information carefully, strategically to the press. Not a word about his fraud case. No, that was for the courts. But he planted subtle hints about the personal betrayal, the control, and the manipulation. He didn't need to expose every detail. All he needed was for people to start whispering, for Karen and Mark's perfect little world to start cracking at the seams. He wanted them to feel the weight of their own lies. When the day finally came, Richard stood at his front door waiting for Karen to arrive. She had called earlier that morning, her voice tense, her words stilted, as though she knew something was coming. She asked to meet him to discuss the family situation. Richard had agreed to the meeting, knowing full well that this was the moment everything would come to a head. She arrived, flanked by Mark, who still wore that smug, self-assured grin. They had come expecting to either intimidate or guilt Richard into backing down. They didn't realize they had already lost. Dad, Karen said, her voice feigning concern but tinged with frustration. This has gone far enough. You need to stop this. Richard stood tall, looking at her not with anger but with the unshakable calm that had defined his transformation. He had already won. The court case, the financial destruction, the public humiliation, it was all in motion. I'm not stopping, Karen, Richard said, his voice low but firm. This isn't about me anymore, it's about what you've done. You took everything from me and now you'll face the consequences. Mark stepped forward, trying to assert his dominance. You don't have a choice in this, old man. You can't fight us. Richard's eyes locked onto Mark's, and for the first time Mark saw the fear in his eyes, but it wasn't fear of him. It was the fear of losing everything. Richard wasn't afraid anymore. No, Richard said, you've already lost. The final legal hearing arrived. The courtroom was tense, filled with lawyers, witnesses, and the inevitable weight of judgment. Karen and Mark sat across from Richard, their faces pale, their confidence shattered. They had thought they could control the situation, manipulate the evidence, and push Richard into submission. But now they sat helpless, trapped by their own lies. When the judge delivered his verdict, there was no question about the outcome. Richard had meticulously documented everything, and the evidence was irrefutable. Karen and Mark were found guilty of financial fraud, forgery, exploitation. Their assets were seized, their financial stability shattered, and they were publicly humiliated. The court ruled in Richard's favor, giving him not only financial restitution but a victory over the years of manipulation and abuse he had suffered. Karen and Mark were devastated. Their perfect world had crumbled, leaving them with nothing but the fallout of their own actions. Richard, on the other hand, felt a sense of relief, but it wasn't the relief he expected. There was no triumphant joy in the aftermath, no gloating, just the quiet satisfaction that justice had been served. But Richard's victory wasn't just in the courtroom. It was in reclaiming his life, his dignity, and his peace. He had not only taken back what was rightfully his, but had shown Karen and Mark the cost of contempt. The courthouse had emptied. The courtroom, once filled with tension and the harsh murmur of legal disputes, was now quiet. The gavel had struck and the judgment had been made. Karen and Mark, once so confident, had been reduced to shadows of their former selves. The courtroom's drama had come to an end, but Richard's story was far from over. This was not just a tale of victory, but one of healing, reconciliation, and the quiet reflection of a life altered by years of manipulation and betrayal. After the court ruling, Richard stood outside the courthouse, taking in the cool autumn air. The wind blew gently, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves, and for a moment it was as if the world had shifted back into its natural rhythm. Richard, however, felt different. This wasn't a victory for him in the traditional sense. There was no elation, no sense of triumph or vengeance. Instead, there was a calm and unshakable silence that had settled deep within him. The journey from pain and betrayal to strength had not been about destroying those who had wronged him. It had been about reclaiming something much more valuable, his peace. The silence he felt now was not one of submission, but one of ownership over his life, his dignity, and his future. As Richard walked away from the courthouse, his steps felt deliberate, as though each one carried him further away from the man he had once been. The man who had been passive, who had accepted the mistreatment from his own daughter and son-in-law. The old Richard had been a man of kindness, of sacrifice, but this new Richard, he was someone who had found the strength to stand firm, to fight back when it mattered most. The years spent in the shadow of his own family's cruelty had taken a toll on Richard. He had learned to live in silence, to absorb the pain, the insults, the betrayals, without ever raising his voice. But as the weight of the gavel's echo faded, Richard understood that silence no longer needed to be a tool for survival. It was now his choice. Silence no longer meant weakness, it meant resolution. In the days following the court ruling, Richard found a new sense of clarity. He didn't feel the need to shout or demand anything from anyone. Instead, he settled into the quiet moments of his life, reflecting on the choices he had made, the actions he had taken, and the impact they had on his own sense of self. He took long walks, allowing his thoughts to wander as freely as the breeze that swept across the open fields. He spent time in his garden, tending to the plants as a way of reconnecting with the earth beneath his feet. Richard was learning, slowly but surely, that healing didn't come from revenge, it came from acceptance. The world around him continued to turn, but Richard felt as if he was at peace with its movements, no longer caught up in the storm of conflict that had once consumed him. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, Richard found himself standing in front of his old house. It felt almost surreal to be here again, after everything that had transpired. The house that had once been filled with love, laughter, and family gatherings now stood quiet, almost abandoned. Richard couldn't help but feel a bittersweet nostalgia for the days when things had been simpler before everything had fallen apart. He stood there for a long time, his eyes scanning the windows, the front porch where he had spent countless evenings with his family. He remembered the sound of Karen's laughter when she was a little girl, the way she would run up to him after school and hug him as if nothing in the world could ever separate them. But that was before the lies. Before the manipulation, before the coffee had scalded his legs and the betrayal had ripped apart everything he had once held dear. And yet Richard knew that it was time to move on. This house no longer held the same meaning it once had. It wasn't just a building, it was a monument to everything he had lost, but also to everything he had gained in the process. His strength, his resolve, his peace. He took a deep breath, exhaling slowly, as if releasing all the tension that had been building inside him for so many years. He wasn't here to seek closure. He wasn't here to fix anything. He was here to say goodbye to the past. Over the weeks that followed, Richard found himself increasingly closer to his grandson, Evan. Their bond, though tenuous at first, had grown stronger as they spent time together. Evan had been caught in the crossfire of his parents' turmoil, confused and angry, but he had seen enough, heard enough, and understood enough to make his own decisions. One evening, as Richard sat at his kitchen table, Evan came over, his usual awkwardness gone. He sat across from Richard, his eyes tired but alert, as though he had something important to say. "Grandpa," Evan said, his voice steady, "I've been thinking about everything that happened, about what you did. I don't know what to think anymore." Richard looked at Evan, his heart heavy but not sad. He could see the confusion and the hurt in his eyes, but he also saw something else, the seed of understanding. The very same seed that had once grown in Karen before it had been buried by the weight of greed and manipulation. "I know, Evan," Richard replied softly. "It's hard to see everything clearly when you're in the middle of it all, but sometimes we have to make tough choices, even when we don't fully understand why." Evan nodded, his hands fidgeting nervously on the table. I don't want to make the same mistakes they did. I don't want to end up like them." Richard smiled gently. "You won't, Evan. You're different. You have the power to choose who you want to be, and you've already started, for the first time in a long while." Richard felt something stir in his chest, a quiet pride. The future wasn't just in his hands anymore, it was in Evan's. Richard had done his part in the story. Now it was Evan's turn to decide how he would shape his own path. Months passed, and the aftermath of the court case settled into a quiet routine. Richard continued to live his life in his small apartment, free from the weight of his past. He had reclaimed his dignity, and with it, his sense of self. He wasn't a victim anymore. He wasn't a pawn in someone else's game. He was his own man, standing tall in the face of everything he had lost. Karen, for her part, had attempted to reconnect. She had called Richard a few times, each time with a different tone, sometimes apologetic, sometimes defensive. But Richard knew better than to jump into any emotional plea without first seeing the change in her heart. Apologies, after all, are meaningless without action. He didn't rush to forgive her. Instead, he allowed her to come to him when she was ready, when she truly understood what she had done. Forgiveness, like everything else, had to be earned. Richard continued to stay close to Evan, guiding him as best he could, sharing stories from his past, and giving him the tools he would need to navigate his own future. Richard's legacy wasn't about the money or the house or the court case, it was about the lessons he passed down to the next generation. One afternoon, Richard sat on his porch, watching the sun set in the sky. It was a peaceful moment, one that he had never thought he would experience again. He had been through so much betrayal, loss, pain, but now he was free. The past was behind him and the future was uncertain, but for the first time in years he felt ready to face whatever came next. The silence, once heavy and suffocating, was now his ally. It was the silence of a man who had found his way back to peace. As he sipped his coffee, watching the world around him, Richard smiled, knowing that his journey had only just begun. The chapter of betrayal and revenge had closed, but now it was time to write a new story, a story of redemption, healing, and most importantly, a story of hope. Thank you for joining me on this journey. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the playlist now showing on.